Advocates who are fighting to end the gender pay gap have launched a new campaign calling for greater transparency about how much people get paid in New Brunswick. The NB Coalition for Pay Equity says the province should introduce pay transparency legislation. This would require employers to include salary ranges in job postings, for example. It would also protect workers' rights to discuss their pay and ban questions about past salaries during the hiring process. And it would require big companies to report their pay gaps.
It's important because it goes hand in hand with pay equity. To know there's a problem, we need to know what are our salaries. So pay transparency is basically having the base of forcing employers to talk about salaries, to give the right of employees to talk about their salaries, and to ensure that it is common knowledge what are the pay grades within our business or location to work with that.
And so you're looking for the provincial government to introduce a legislation requiring pay transparency, correct?
Absolutely, because we've seen in the past that voluntary methods don't work. So we've been working for pay equity to have a legislation in the sector, private sector, for the past long 20 years. We're still working on that, but we want to introduce the pay transparency piece as well to ensure that we have the full bundle to ensure that we can close that gender pay gap.
And just briefly, how would it work? How would it be implemented or enforced?
Well, we're still working on that. We're hoping to work with our partners at the provincial level to figure out what would be the best mechanism. We do have some basic foundational elements that we want to see in the pay transparency legislation. So proactive and enforcement mechanism to ensure that employers will be obligated to put in forth a plan around pay transparency and their pay grids, and to make sure that we can have recourses if those aren't done properly.
The launch featured a talk by Toronto-based lawyer Jan Borrowy, who is co-chair of Ontario's Equal Pay Coalition. She outlined how pay equity works by way of example.
So, for the childcare worker, in the City of Toronto's municipal pay equity plan, the comparator was a zookeeper, equal value. The zookeeper was taking care of chimpanzees. The childcare worker was underpaid by more than $5 an hour and taking care of children, humans. So the pay equity plan fixed that. But would that have been covered by equal pay? No, because it was a different job. One's a zookeeper, the other's a childcare worker, different work. That's how pay equity steps in to fix that.
Women tend to be concentrated in low-paid fields compared to men, particularly caregiving work. Racialized women tend to earn even less than white women. In part, that's because they are disproportionately represented in work that is underpaid, non-unionized, and with limited benefits and protections. Provincial pay equity legislation for the public service came into effect in 2010, but the act does not apply to the private sector. The provincial government under Premier Susan Holt has pledged to introduce pay equity legislation covering the private sector, but no timeline has been set. The NB Media Co-op has reached out to the provincial government for comment. Check out our website for updates. Stay tuned for the full presentation by Labour lawyer Jan Borrowy. For the NB Media Co-op, this is Jigmet Angmo with reporting by David Gordon-Quash.
I'm from the Ontario Pay Equity Coalition. That coalition was formed in 1976. We meet regularly. We advocate to close the gender pay gap. It's a coalescence of feminist organizations, trade unions, community organizations, and employer groups working together to close the gap. We intervene on major key legal cases. We're involved with advocacy, and we assist in collective bargaining. Okay, our starting point. This won't surprise any of you. Women's work in this country is undervalued and underpaid. That's the starting point. Part of the reason for that is that women's work is focused and segregated into specific categories, often called the 5 C's. It's known as the care economy. whereby, and it's deeply ingrained in the labor market across Canada, it doesn't matter the province, where women are primarily in caring occupations, which includes cleaning, they primarily in cleaning, clerical, catering, and retailing. Women's work is segregated in this country, and it's deeply ingrained, and in particular, it hasn't really truly changed in 5 decades. That's a major issue. But we're also faced with a culture of secrecy in our workplaces. Many employers, frankly, have policies and procedures which say, no, you're not allowed to talk about your pay. No, you can't tell your coworkers how much you're making. And that culture is pervaded for, frankly, far too long because they see many of us as workers as just simply another commodity and as something that employers get to control, and we have no say in a workplace. It fills workplaces with fear, and frankly, it's used by employers to perpetuate a gender wage gap. And I'm going to talk about the Lily Ledbetter case in a minute, but keep that in the back of your minds. It may be some interest of how where it gives us an indication of where pay transparency comes from. Okay. The fundamental problem we're faced with here in New Brunswick is a $2.50 gender pay gap based on hours alone. That's deep, it's persisted for a very long time. And frankly, across the country, gender pay gaps haven't been shifting in the last 20, 30 years. Now, this slide, sorry it's a bit tough to see, is from Ontario, which demonstrates that the pay gap, if you use an average, actually doesn't give you the whole picture. You need to understand the pay gap through an intersectional lens. You need to understand what the impact is across women who are racialized, Indigenous women, Black women, because it's different. And in fact, the Ontario Pay Coalition in the next coming months will be sending out, has a campaign running to advise people and educate them about the deep pay gaps that exist for Black women, for Indigenous women, and it looks different. And I think, frankly, the Coalition's new flyer, which demonstrates the depths of the pay gaps on an intersectional lens, you'll see that some of these are different than what we have here on the slide, but this gives you an indication of how deep the gender pay gap is and what a big problem it is. Okay, point first. Here's my main message. I still want you to pay attention for the rest of the presentation, but here's the main message. Pay transparency and pay equity are excellent tools, effective tools for closing the gender pay gap with some ifs. If they're applied to all employers in both the public sector and the private sector. If they're proactive, which means employers have to, and their partners in the workplace, unions and employees, are required to create plans which examine what the problem is and the plan to close it. That plan has to deal with the deep gender inequalities, and best if done on an intersectional way. Third point, you need to combine pay equity and pay transparency together. It's not good enough to leave things floating in midair just with pay transparency, and I'll explain that later through the presentation. And finally, you need effective mechanisms for enforcement. It's not good enough for an employer to simply post something, I think, to name and shame. You need to drill down and have an effective enforcement mechanism, which includes the options for enforcement agencies to issue compliance orders, the rights of workers to file complaints, and penalties for non-compliance. What's important is, and I'm not sure where it went, but oh, here it is. There was a very important task force report completed by Dr. Adele Blackett with a tripartite group formed under and by the federal government to look at the Employment Equity Act itself, which is where the federal pay transparency laws exist. She has an awful lot to say in this. I think if there's anything you read in the next month, please read this. I I've got sticky notes to help summarize it. But the idea is, she said, look, if the laws on equity are not harmonized, they're not pulled together, then the complexity of the systemic discrimination that we're dealing with will be undermined. So if things are off in different silos, that's going to be a problem. It needs to be harmonized and brought together, and that's where the transformative potential is, and meaning, in lay terms, how we close the gender pay gap. Okay, but today for me, frankly, I think hope's in the air. I'm going to try to be an optimistic person. Because here's one of the most interesting things. Canada signed on to the United Nations Goals for Sustainable Development. Those, in fact, call for closing the gender pay gap by 2030. That's just 5 years away. I'm pretty sure we can do that. If we've got the right pieces in place. Well, here's the other reason for hope. There's a new political promise for pay equity by the whole government. Built into the platform is a promise to phase in pay equity in the private and the care sectors using a model similar to Ontario and Quebec. I can talk to you about that. It also means if it's similar to Ontario and Quebec, it will be similar to the federal jurisdiction's pay equity as well. The three of them are the most proactive pieces of legislation in the country. Okay, and why should we do this? And why do I have hope? Because there's three big wins, which I think is important piece of the campaign. Everybody needs to think about the wins. The first big win is that we're going to see a win for workers. Women's wages increase, and there's less downward pressure on men's wages. You know, the lower the wages in a sector, everybody's wages are pulled down. It's just that simple. You increase women's wages, that helps everyone. It also helps their families, obviously. It's good for employers, and this research exists if you really want to dive into it. It enhances recruitment and retention. It attracts talent. It fosters trust. It builds a respectful workplace of everyone. It just ensures fair and consistent pay. You know, and finally, it's good for the economy. And I'll get into some of the stats in a minute. But frankly, if you want to boost New Brunswick's GDP, the quickest way to do that is to close the gender pay gap. There's a lot of discussion around what's happening with tariffs, and I get it. But you know, time and time again, the conversation is about jobs that are male-dominated. And it appears that women's work is left off the agenda. That, and with due respect, is, I think, short-sighted. And frankly, really, truly misses what is going on in our economy unless we focus in on women's work. Okay, where do we sit now with respect to fundamental rights in New Brunswick? So I'll run through this part quickly. I'll talk a bit about the existing rights and then really drill down into where pay equity is situated. The first, wage. Let's keep in mind that anything we're talking about is dealing on a playing field right now where wage discrimination is illegal. It's prohibited. It has been prohibited in this province since 1973 in the Human Rights Code. It's a baseline. It's a baseline entitlement that must be enforced. Second, let's back that up. Women have a right to equal pay for equal work. Now, what that means is that if the Employment Standards Act prohibits discrimination if it's women doing the same or similar job to men's jobs. And those kind of laws were introduced in Canada through the 60s and 70s. And if you were, let's say, a nursing aide, and in fact that was the same as a porter's job, or a similar kind of work, you got the same pay. That's equal pay. Those were the first iteration of positive and important rights around women's work. But again, the focus is on the same job. One of the drawbacks, like the Human Rights Code, is that it required individual employees to come forward to file complaints. Think back to the slide about secrecy and about the fear in the workplace. How many many folks are going to come forward. The third and fundamental right is equal pay for work of equal value. Now, New Brunswick has only dipped its little toe into pay equity. This is what refers to pay equity. Right now, equal pay for work of equal value applies strictly to the public sector only in this province. The act was last amended in 2009. And what this involves is a comparison of different jobs. So one example in Ontario was childcare workers, entirely female-dominated work. Undervalued, underpaid, because guess what? It matches the kind of work, changing the poopy diapers we do at home. You go into a workplace where we drop our kids off, you change the poopy diapers. Oh, funny thing, long-term care. I can tell a couple of cases I've been working on that all center around poopy diapers. Long-term care. It's women's work, because people can't distinguish what we actually do in a workplace versus what gets done at home. Well, pay equity comes in to say we can actually bring about change. So for the childcare worker, in the City of Toronto's municipal pay equity plan, the comparator was a zookeeper, equal value. The zookeeper was taking care of chimpanzees. The childcare worker was underpaid by more than $5 an hour and taking care of children, humans. So the pay equity plan fixed that. But would that have been covered by equal pay? No, because it was a different job. One was a zookeeper, the other was a childcare worker, different work. That's how pay equity steps in to fix that. Jobs are evaluated through a gender-neutral comparison system that works then once, if they're of equal value, they compare their wage rates. And from that point, what you're doing is actually truly valuing women's work in a way traditionally has been undervalued. Okay, as the Supreme Court says, and I'll promise not to put too much of the Supreme Court quotes on you, but truly what the Pay Equity Act does is aimed at fixing the wage gap, which is driven by the gendered segregation in employment and the systemic undervaluation of work typically performed by women. That's what pay equity does. It goes in and says, we know women are clustered or pushed into certain kinds of jobs. That's undervalued, underpaid, and pay equity steps in to fix it. So proactive pay equity, I would suggest to you here in New Brunswick, your time's come. This is it. There have been at least three royal commissions that have said you need pay equity, you need proactive pay equity. And by proactive, that requires employers to create plans, and it also applies to the private sector and the public sector. Oh, there's been this fourth task force. How many task force do we need? That supports proactive pay equity laws, frankly, and says that we need this on clear timelines, and we need this with commitments if we want to truly create a barrier-free Canada. I just want to pause. I have huge respect for the chair, Adele Blackett. She's a law prof at McGill University. This was a tripartite group. This is employers who came together to make over 100 recommendations, including on how to create a barrier-free and equitable Canada. Employers, community organizations, trade unions, academics were all a part of this. And they came to these thoughtful recommendations. And what the task force heard time again from employers is that they said, equity matters, and we actually are committed to it. So I think it's very important as a counterbalance, frankly, to what we're hearing from the United States. Elbows up, everybody. Okay, let's get into pay transparency. Pay transparency is this new tool, this new iteration on the scene to really root out wage discrimination. It works hand in hand with equal pay. It works hand in hand with pay equity, or at least it should. What it essentially does is allow workers to get access to information to protect their rights and enforce pay equity and equal pay. Because without access to information, women can't enforce their rights. Now, we have a little, where's Rochelle? Oh, Rochelle, I just wanted, you're going to give me a hand with the video. So I'll just, to help set up this video, this is from the Equal Pay International Coalition. It is a organization coordinated through the United Nations. Canada is a member of this. It includes the OECD, many member countries who are really driving the push on pay transparency. Okay.
What gaps still exist? Because the many factors contributing to the gender pay gap still persist. Pay transparency legislation and policies can be a tool to achieve equal pay for work of equal value. And pay transparency legislation has become one of the tools for exposing the reasons behind the gender pay gap. Glass ceiling, glass wall, feminized sectors, discrimination, care penalty. Legislation promoting pay transparency reveals gender bias or pay discrimination. Pay transparency helps employers and workers address the gender pay gap. Reveal the gap to close the gap.
Just a quick little
Why
overview.
do
Oh,
gaps still?
I'd encourage you to take that video and show it around. Okay, so what do the laws provide? It helps build accountability because it reveals when men and women are paid differently for the same work. You go in there, you're analyzing who is paid what. When female-dominated jobs are underpaid relative to men's of similar value, most employers actually use some type of value system to rank jobs in a company. This is an opportunity to get in and say, how did you do it and what factors did you apply for that valuing? Where women are concentrated in precarious employment, like why are all women or a majority of women casual? That's a question that can be asked by pay transparency. And you can get in there and look at the glass ceilings, the glass where women are being barred from advancing through a company, or the glass walls where you can't move across horizontally into another job, or what get called the sticky floors. In other words, there's no career progression, all of which all together are elements of systemic discrimination. Okay, what are the trends? 21 of 38 OECD countries have pay transparency. The United States has had this, has been a real push, frankly, since the famous Lilly Ledbetter case. This is a woman who was a supervisor. She was working side by side in a factory with a number of men. She was paid $20,000 less. She didn't know that until somebody slipped her a note. And then she kicked off a campaign for equitable wages. I won't get into the nasty, nasty fight that took her all the way to the US Supreme Court. But because of some limits that emerged around the law, President Obama in 2009 passed the Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. There's 14 states that have specific pay transparency and a number of cities that have implemented this as a bylaw. So in other words, you don't have to just depend on your provincial government. What's the city of Moncton doing to ensure it has pay transparency? Australia's had it, been working on it since 2012. That formed the basis for what we did in Ontario to some extent. We've got the European Union started to get active in 2014 on this. United Kingdom passed a particular law in 2017 which influenced the federal jurisdiction here in Canada. We have the Ontario law which included a whole combination of measures which I'll describe in a minute. Unfortunately, that law got shelved when the then Liberal government was unelected and the Ford Conservative government was elected and has solely and strictly introduced a job posting requirement in employment standards. We've had it federally for a very long time, but more particularly since 2020, and other provinces like BC and PEI, and I can go on. But let me ask you this. How many of you would be surprised to learn that pay transparency has actually been talked about in Canada since 1984? Everybody else is sitting on their hands going, oh, when? Whatever. Okay, move on. So 1984, one of the big royal commissions was Rosalia Bella. The goal of that commission was frankly to explore ways to deal with and build equality in workplaces. And one of the core components was to say, look at, well, she said two things. You've got to examine and assess where incomes are in your companies, in your workplaces, across 4 different entities, across looking at gender, looking at Indigenous peoples, racialized peoples, and people with disabilities. Now, the Act has different old names in it, but 4 groups. And she also said you need to have equal pay for work of equal value at the same time. Part of the importance of this Abella Commission is that I think it gives us an indication of what we have to watch out for in designing pay transparency. So I want to talk about design now for the next few minutes. She rejected volunteerism, meaning that employers can do it by themselves. She said you're not going to really achieve equality if you just have public scrutiny on this, what I call the name and the shaming approach. She concluded that public reporting as the sole enforcement device was not going to be effective at all. And so she recommended, which I would concur with, 3 key elements. They were proactive requirement for employers to implement what she called employment equity, which included pay equity and included a broad holistic approach to removing barriers. She called for the collection and annual filing of data, and that in fact has been happening in Canada amongst federal jurisdiction employers. In the private sector with over 100 employees. Look at the occupational distribution, she said, look at the income levels, but she also called for a strong enforcement mechanism. Really important considerations. So since that task force, what are all of the measures? So, we won't run through this I won't read all of this out, but there are a number of them. You start from pre-employment, and then you build through to enforcement mechanisms. And some of the key ones are publicly advertising salaries, a position's salary before people are hired, a prohibition on employers asking everybody what their salary was previously, because that suddenly becomes where you get socked in. Disclose pay to all employees. Access to information on the pay levels in an enterprise. No reprisals. Publicly advertising and displaying this information to everybody, not only in the workplace, but publicly. There's an ongoing loop of regular assessment of plans to stop any discrimination, repair any discrimination that is found, create a timetable for completion, ensure that you've got a strong enforcement mechanism with audits, with enforceable orders and fines, and having an independent government body, whether it's something comparable to, in Ontario, would be the Pay Equity Office and the Commission in that tribunal, or the Human Rights Group, as it is in the Commission, as it is federally, or in some cases they've gone to labor boards. So when you think about pay transparency measures, and this is a bit of an educational for everybody here, there's a continuum. There isn't just one. And people can say pay transparency, and it means different things to different people because of that full range of measures. But if you think about it, the most minimum, the necessary but insufficient, frankly, are just at the pre-employment stage of postings of salaries and ranges. That's just the minimum. But if you really want to close the gender pay gap by 2030, which I'd love to, I'd love to be out of work, please. The most effective are the combination of equal pay with pay equity requirements, detailed job class analysis, and then building on the public reporting on a timetable, and on it goes to including specialized enforcement mechanisms. So, to go back, minimum standards approach is used in PEI in Ontario. And as I mentioned, Ontario's law is not the proactive pay equity, proactive pay transparency act was shelved. We have some provinces which have introduced standalone specific legislation, and that includes British Columbia as an example. And it takes it up to the point of an annual report to the minister, as well as a pay transparency report has to go on an employer's website. But that's as far as it goes. What's missing? Adequate enforcement. In its report, I will say that what the government has done to their credit is collated all of the information that's come in these reports and put it into an annual pay transparency report. It demonstrated in its last report, in BC, that women earned on average 15% less than men. The median hourly pay gap of 5 of 7 employers, men were paid up to 20% more. So if you land on this information, and this is being publicized, if you name it and supposedly shame it, then what happens? Well, let's, well, we'll get there. So, no proactive, so important about BC is that it does not have proactive pay equity legislation at all. There's no enforcement mechanisms. And again, it's just this name and shame approach. Okay, the federal jurisdiction. This gets interesting. There has been under the Employment Equity Act the requirement of federally regulated employers to file reports. I'm going to scoot through this for time. What of great interest is this, as a result of changes and amendments to the Employment Equity Act and updating of the regulation in 2020, and following what was done in the United Kingdom, Canada created the Equivision Employment Equity Tool. Now that title makes you wonder, does that have anything to do with pay transparency? Well, it actually does, because it collates all of the reports filed by employers. And here's New Brunswick. It demonstrates for New Brunswick that there's a 10% pay equity gap amongst all federally regulated private sector employers with 100 or more employees. Now 10% is a fair chunk. It's $1, at least $1 an hour. Now there are a number of reasons why this figure is different than what we get in Stats Canada, and we won't get into that unless you really want to afterwards. Okay, there's 13 federally regulated employers. Here they are. Acadia Broadcasting, you can see the list here. Dan Ross, these names may mean something to you. Midland Transport. So federally regulated includes things like transportation where you cross borders, broadcasting, telecommunications, and the list goes on for that. What's that, banks in there? Yes, banks. Good point. Okay, so the first example here is Acadia Broadcasting. Now, Acadia Broadcasting reports show, again, these reports are done by 4 different groups, demonstrates on gender equality, on a pay gap, men and women, they're at 100%, but with Indigenous peoples, they're not. This bar here represents pay for people with disabilities, so they're paying people with disabilities. It's not demonstrating a gap, and they're even no gap at all for racialized peoples. Well, here we go over to Casse Populaire. Oh, there's a gap, 31.7%, and on it goes racialized people 15%, people with disabilities 15%, 38% Indigenous people. What's this one? Oh, what have we got? Oh, Campfield Aviation. They're demonstrating a gap of 28%, and on it goes. And here at Midland Transport, they're saying a 6% gap. Racialized people, no gap. People with disabilities, 6%. So, this website, and I encourage you all to do this, go in, take a look. You can look at company reports and get into what their pay structure looks like by the defined occupational groups in the Act. So it's a bit different than the way we approach pay equity, because you've got these very broad categories of occupational groups, but nonetheless, it displays what the issues are. Question is, what are they doing about it? Well, the lack of enforcement in the federal employment equity regime has been criticized for a very long time, including the new pay transparency approach. The task force concluded, look, this is enough. We need new enforcement mechanisms. We need to harmonize and pull together pay transparency and pay equity. We need an employment equity commissioner. We actually need new enforcement mechanisms written into the Act. Happy to answer questions about this and the specificity of that later, but just let me say to you that they call for rigorous enforcement and the ability to go up to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal with complaints for workers. But keep in mind, the employer is identifying these gaps already, and there should be a plan in place to close them. If that's not happening, it should be available. Okay, the last place to talk about jurisdiction is the European Union. Its pay transparency directive, which is going out to every European Union, requires every European Union country, requires pay transparency laws to be in place as of June 7th, 2026. So what happens with the directive is that it states things broadly, has a number of principles that must be followed, and then each country has to operationalize those. And what it calls for is to strengthen, its whole purpose is to strengthen the application of equal pay for work, equal pay for equal work, and pay equity through pay transparency and reinforced enforcement mechanisms. So the European Union has got, they know if we're going to close the gender pay gap by 2030, we need to move quickly on new enforcement mechanisms. I won't, for time's sake, I won't go into all of the comprehensive ways. You can read this on the slide deck, but it is truly the most comprehensive top to bottom, from the pre-employment posting of job information to the creation of plans to rigorous enforcement mechanisms. It covers the gamut of the continuum, and I think we should pay a lot of attention to that. So I say we have a unique opportunity here to combine and harmonize equal pay and pay equity together to apply to all employers, to create plans to close these gaps and post those in the workplace, to ensure that pre-employment ads are the wages are shown and made public. We ensure there are protections against reprisals, strong enforcement, and an expanded role for the Pay Equity Office. And my rationale is, look, there are truly, as I said, 3 wins. Women's wages increase, we stop the downward pressure on men's wages, and frankly, workers have a greater sense of dignity in the workplace. That's what this is about. You know, you walk into a workplace and you feel as if, well, you're not valued as much. You're not going to be the best worker for your employer. It's good for employers. I've talked about this already. It enhances recruitment and retention. And, you know, it's interesting for childcare workers. It demonstrates that if you've got wages, there's a very important economist, Pierre Fortin, which has repeatedly demonstrated that the higher childcare workers' wages are, the better retention, the better recruitment, people feel valued, and it makes a difference. Economists agree that it makes a difference. one of the pieces that's interesting is that, you know, if you've got a wide application of pay transparency and pay equity, the benchmarking goes to equity. It's not about a race to the bottom. It's about a benchmark to equity. And is it good for the economy? It sure is. When the federal government introduced their pay transparency, they relied on the McKinsey Global Institute to advance pay that looked at this and found that, look, this could put in 150 billion into the Canadian economy if done right. In Ontario, when we looked at this, it was analyzed, the provincial government analyzed in 2016 through Deloitte Touche that there are many ways in which the economy could benefit, particularly by ensuring women had full income in their pockets. And because the impact of the gap was calculated generally and just averaged at $7,200 per woman per year. That money could flow into the economy, and then it was analyzed that the fact was, by maintaining the gap, the province was losing $18 billion a year, which was 2.5% of the GDP, which was the equivalent of the auto parts sector. Funny thing, we're talking a lot about auto parts now, at least in Ontario. We haven't heard much about the gender pay gap, although we've been trying. So, here's the thing. The Supreme Court has said, Justice Rosalie Bell has said, let's think about this. If you leave these inequities in place, who are the shock absorbers? Who's taking up the space? Who's absorbing things in the economy? And it's women. And that's why these inequities should not be left in place. I think with smart, effective measures, frankly, that we can close this gender pay gap. I'm very hopeful by 2030. As I said, apply it to all employers, make it proactive, combine it together, pay equity and pay transparency, and have effective enforcement mechanisms. And how are we going to get there? Well, we're going to take some action. This is one of our slogans. We spread the word. An MPP is a member of provincial parliament in Ontario. I think you've got some equivalents here. You know, get regular updates, stay involved, support the coalition and all of its efforts and its campaign. And frankly, I think we can do this. We can make a difference. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to any questions.
Thank you very much. S'il y a des questions, if there's questions that you would like to ask Jan, so if there's questions, I will bring the mic in.
Thank you very much for taking my question. I had a question about recruiters. So recruiting companies, are often used, for example, by small nonprofits that have elected boards who have no experience hiring and firing. And I wonder whether this is sort of a bit of a gap in the pay equity lens, because of course, if recruiters themselves are not bound to tell recruitees what the company previously paid a person that they hired, what is to say that the next person being hired isn't going to be exploited? Thank you.
So I think that's a really important point. There are many, many types of companies across Canada that do use recruiters that basically are contracting out what used to be a human resources function of hiring. So built into the legislation would have to be a protection to ensure that it is the source employer's salary that's being posted and considered. Because the recruiter is simply acting on as an agent on behalf of that employer. And so that link would have to be made. It's a really important point. Thanks for raising it. But I don't think, you're not being employed, let's be clear, you're not being employed by the recruiter. You're simply going out making phone calls, and then you're being placed into the workplace. Now, we could get into the weeds of the details around temporary agencies and how to control that. In Ontario, we've been making efforts to control the way temporary agencies are used as a secondary low-income, low-paid workforce to undercut the main workforce, and that would have to be accounted for as well. Which, in fact, if I could just for a moment, in the Ontario legislation, when it was being brought in, there was also a number of very important new measures to ensure equal pay for precariously employed workers, including those in temporary agencies. And so it was a complete, interesting package that was brought in, all of which was shelved by the Conservative government.
Oh, we have questions in front.
Yeah.
We can do that.
Okay. Compliance, I think we've talked about for that person. Wage structure outside the workplace, yes, the idea is posting, like the Equivision. Challenges that might arise from implementing pay transparency. I mean, I prefer a conversation about this. You know, there are employers who will not be interested in any of this. On the other hand, I think if, you know, there's a train to get on, it's best to get on the pay transparency train. The economy has not fallen apart with the use of pay transparency in the federal jurisdiction. Equivision is an example of that. It's not that tough, and it actually helps. So I think there are answers to people who don't think it's useful. How do we ensure that our female general labor workers are paid equally? Well, that to me as an equal pay question. This is where pay transparency, I think, is really critical. And in fact, many people saw, and it has been used, as an instrument really to support equal pay initially. And now, of course, with the example of the EU and others, it can apply to and should apply with pay equity. So, you know, you make it transparent, women are going to find out. I mean, in my regular practice, I get multiple calls during a week from women saying, I think I just learned that the guy next to me is making $10,000 a year more than I am in a non-union workplace. And then we walk through what to do. And some of them, you know, frankly, have gone and had conversations with employers and say, do you want to blow this up? I've already talked to the Equal Pay Coalition. They're like, no, and they pay them. That's when naming and shaming works. How can you share salary info without causing conflict? That's a really important question, I think, that gets at the heart of the secrecy issue. It has to be regulated. It has to be through legislation, where it applies to everybody. Because if it's just done voluntarily, you are going to cause conflicts. But if it's applying to everybody, in every place of employment, it's going to reduce the conflict, it seems to me. And I'm sure some folks here have much smarter answers than I do on that question. Other questions?
Shouldn't have wear heels.
Thank you, and thank you, Jan, and the coalition for this wonderful. I feel enthusiastic what you're saying. But I have a question. I worked in the nonprofit sector for many years, and one of the things that in the nonprofit is, when you talk about pay transparency, we didn't know what, say, the executive director made an X, organization, and there was this attitude that, well, we're working for a nonprofit, we're sort of volunteering, our expenses are low, we don't have to pay our mortgage. And I'm wondering if there's studies across the country with comparative salaries and how, the transparency on these occupations, and how do we, if it isn't happening, how do we find that out? Because I think a lot of people are working underpaid, undervalued, and they don't know that, say, X organization, and it could be run by men too, we don't know, but anyway, just wondering what your thoughts are on that. Thank you.
You don't have those.
So it's a couple of reflections. I go back to the work I've done on pay equity in Ontario, which applied pay equity to the not-for-profit sector. And actually, the executive directors themselves saw some of the biggest benefits, because in Ontario, pay equity for particularly nonprofits that are funded by the government, it's called proxy, and their there's a regulation that set their comparator to either hospital or municipality, and the not-for-profit sector benefited enormously. But I think that, you know, it's, number two is whether or not there are studies done on this. I would have to, I don't know of any off the top of my head, although I know the gang at the Ontario Not-for-Profit organization has been starting to track data and try to pull better data from Stats Canada. So it's worth checking with the Ontario, and Pam Upple, at the Ontario Not-for-Profit Network. And oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, maybe the folks in New Brunswick have done this, they don't.
Yeah. But the other issue is, how do we know, you know, when somebody might be looking at this nonprofit versus the others? And this, you know, this is where pay transparency, I think, will make a big difference. As more and more salaries are published, pre-employment, and then as. Now, can you imagine Equivision if that was applying to the not-for-profit sector as well? Because it's there. And you can, it's one of the things Equivision does do is distill out some of the gaps at the most senior level, and on those it has 13 different categories.
Thank you. It's a start. That's a good start. Yeah.
And I will add that currently the coalition has a project on pay equity in the community sector, so that might help, and we're linking both phases of it, so both facets of the medal to it, so transparency and pay equity.
Thank you.
Okay, George.
Thank you for your presentation. I noticed that you had some of the private federal regulated ones on the board with Midland and such. I represent private sector unions, which was the Bakery, Confectionery, and Tobacco Workers and Grain Growers Union in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And we fight consistently for pay.
Yes.
Saying that, most places that aren't respecting pay equity are those that are non-unionized. So where do I find information on the private sector in this type of situation? Because I think it's really a bargaining chip to unionization. And if we have the freedom of this information and able to get it somewhere, that we could probably go out and organize a lot more workplaces that are unequitable at the present time.
So before I flip it to you, I hope your unions will join our campaign on transparency, and so that will be one thing that you can do.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. In Ontario, the Ontario Federation of Labour is a major player entity with the Equal Pay Coalition, and was 100% behind pay transparency because they knew that it was so important for non-union workers, and also putting a union card in your pocket is frankly, the best way to close the gender pay gap. But where is there an example in Canada where that exists? The only one would be British Columbia, where their law requires employers to put the pay transparency report up on their website. Otherwise, crickets. And federally, it's only for those in the federal jurisdiction, which is what, 5 or 8% of the Canadian economy right now. So it's Nova Scotia, I think, made some efforts to introduce pay transparency, which halted. And it's on hold in Newfoundland. Ontario got shelved.
We would have time for one more question. If not, we're going to... Oh, vas-y.
En français.
En français, vraiment.
Merci.
Est-ce que j'ai bien compris que la loi fédérale présentement oblige la transparence, mais n'oblige pas à l'équité dans le secteur privé? Et le rapport de 2023, il n'y a pas eu de suite à ça. Il n'y a pas de suite. Le gouvernement n'agit pas sur les recommandations. Donc, on ne peut pas savoir, par exemple, si dans les banques, est-ce que parce que c'est un lieu où est-ce que les femmes étaient très présentes, est-ce que ça a amené, l'équité salariale amène une augmentation de leur salaire? Est-ce que ça fait une différence? Parce que c'est ça que c'est important aussi dans nos campagnes, de démontrer qu'est-ce que ça a apporté aux femmes. Parce que quand on parle juste de l'écart, on ne montre pas qu'est-ce qu'on gagne avec la loi.
Merci. So, on on the enforcement question, without getting into all of the weeds and the details, the enforcement of the federal pay transparency is, in Adele, Professor Blackett says herself, like it's practically non-existent. It also ran parallel and separate from the new Pay Equity Act in the federal jurisdiction. So that was a problem, and that's why she called for the harmonization of all equity laws. What are the wins from this? You know, in the bank sector, it's highly non-union, and that's a problem. You know, we tried to organize unions in this country in the 70s, and made some inroads, but not enough. And without a strong enforcement mechanism, then you have to rely on, where did the brother go? On your union, and that, you know, in the banks, that doesn't help. But a good example of how pay equity makes a difference, keep in mind federally, we've actually had the right to equal pay for work of equal value since 1978. It was complaint-based, but many unions advocated for it. I had the great fortune of being involved with the Canadian Union of Postal Workers in their fight for pay equity for their rural and suburban mail carriers. We won, and that meant that women saw over a $5 an hour increase as they were compared to letter carriers. Keep in mind, Canada, the union had been arguing for pay equity for them for years. The employer kept saying no and no and no. When we finally took it in front of an arbitrator, we won more than $5 an hour increase, as well as pension and benefits, and the list went on and on, like glove allowance. The list went on and on and on of the benefits.